in the middle of the United States. It had a pyramid at the center of it, bigger than the Pyramid of Giza. It had a 5,000 square foot building on top. It was an enormous cultural center. It had thousands and thousands of buildings, huge acres of land for farming, irrigation, the whole works. Scavenging bands of isolated families did not make this. This governed over hundreds of thousands of people, and it lasted for centuries and centuries of time. They have found artifacts, in fact, at Cahokia that cover the entire Western Hemisphere, from coast to coast, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, all the way from Inuit territory in Canada, all the way down to the Mayans and Incans, all the way down to Patagonia, all artifacts that have been found here. They had trading partners throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. That's Cahokia, Southern Illinois, constructed by hunters and gatherers. Before they had animal husbandry, before they had money, before we thought they had specialization of jobs, we still thought they were living like wolves when we found this site. That's in America. This was just discovered, though, recently in Turkey. It made the cover of the National Geographic in June 2012, and it's called Göbekli Tepe. Is anyone familiar with this? This is probably yeah. This is probably the single greatest archaeological discovery of the 21st century. So far, by far. The archaeologists who made it have, this is a quote, "Discovering that hunters and gatherers had constructed Göbekli Tepe was like finding that someone had built a 747 in a basement with an X-Acto knife." The reason why it's so stunning is because it's a megalithic site like many others. 5 to 50-ton stones arranged in this sort of Stonehenge way, right? The difference between Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge, though, is that more time has elapsed between the construction of Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe than between the construction of Stonehenge and today. That's how old it is. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. And what that means is it predates, this is the first of its kind, megalithic site that predates the agricultural revolution. Meaning this one had to have been created by hunters and gatherers. It dates to 11,000 years ago. And it's not just one temple. You can see, here's a 12-foot ladder. You can see how enormous it is, but it's not just one temple. They've done ground excavating radar and found over 60 of these in this huge area. What they were doing, they've now found, is that the oldest ones date about 2,000 years earlier than the newest ones. They would make a temple, excavate these huge stones, drag them into place, put them up, make the temple. I don't know how long it would take them. They thought possibly a decade just to make one of these. Tens of thousands of workers. Then they would bury it, and they would start another one. Make it identical. Bury it. Start another one. They did this for over 1,000 years. Now, we could get into the curiosity of what they were thinking. But what's more important is, before the agricultural revolution, hunters and gatherers had the ability to coordinate tens of thousands of workers towards a single project for 1,000 years. That's not scavenging bands of isolated families, is it? No. And this has really blown a hole in our... This would be like if we... I hate to use this analogy because aliens are not responsible for this, guys. I just want you to know that. Humans were. Aliens didn't come down here and think, how are we going to let future generations know that we were here? I'd like to be in on that discussion, just to put that to bed right now. And they were like, well, what we should do, I'd like to... we should just go around the world and cut huge stones and put them into really interesting configurations all over the planet. And then the other guy would be like, well, yeah, but couldn't they have done that? Yeah, they could have. They could have. But it'd be really hard for them to do it. And so this is the way we're going to let future generations know. And then I've been like, just give me your space chute. Just, leave a remote control. One artifact would have solved that riddle. But anyway, humans did this, okay? Our ancestors did this. And what they were capable of doing was coordinating human behavior at a massive scale. And this has led to the understanding that there were just tribal councils, there were regional and national councils involved, okay? This was the structure of hunters and gatherers. And the central council went by different names, like the Council of the Gods or the Council in Heaven. The Egyptians called it the All-Seeing Eye. Now, That's how we know that there were national and regional councils. But how do we know that there was a central council? A lot of people ask that question. Okay, I get it. They were more sophisticated internationally than we thought. But how do they know that they were sending every bit of information to this central council? And that has to do with the patterns in the data. Well, you guys are familiar with pyramids, right? We think of pyramids, we think of Egypt. But actually, we found pyramids all over the world. In every single continent. China, Cambodia, Indonesia, South America, Sudan, just everywhere, Mexico, Italy. Pyramids have been found all over the world. And when you study them, you start to see some remarkable similarities. These pyramids have all been created by people who weren't supposed to know each other. And the blueprints are almost identical. You can see here's Mexico, here's Egypt, here's Cambodia. You couldn't get further away on planet Earth. And yet when you study the pyramids involved, they look almost identical. Look at the top structures. One small door, one bigger door, one small door. And you see this pattern. Look at the archways, almost identical. Focusing in on these two, this is Cambodia, this is Guatemala. These pyramids were made at almost roughly the same time. If you were to see these two pyramids, this is, by the way, in case you're not a geography nut, you could almost put a stake through the earth and find this is on opposite sides of the planet. These two cultures were not supposed to know each other at all. Had no way in our current historical models of how these two cultures could have possibly done this. And these pyramids are almost identical. If you saw these two structures anywhere else in the world, in the modern world, it wouldn't even dawn on you that they weren't made by the same blueprint. Because they were. And yet, there's no explanation for this. And the mystery gets deeper and deeper the more you start to look. This is Dolmen. We used to think Ireland, but now we've seen the same structure all over the world. Here are sphinxes. We used to think Sphinx, we used to think Egypt. But again, we've seen the same image all over the world. I'd like to focus your attention on this one. This is called Cernunnos. He's found in the Gundestrup Cauldron in Denmark. I was just there at the Copenhagen Museum. I got off the plane and I went straight to the Copenhagen Museum, and I was like determined to see this thing. I believe that I've actually, because of the Da Vinci Code, I believe I've cracked the code on what the message is. And so I was absolutely just very excited to see this cauldron. And I went up to the curator, and the curator was like, "You are by far the most excited person to ever see this artifact." But the reason why is because, for what I'm about to show you, you can see that there are 4 animals surrounding this figure, okay? Very specific image, one animal facing away. This is found in Denmark, okay? And it dates to around the year 0. This next image was found in Mesopotamia, and it dates to 2,500 years earlier. And he's called Pashupati. Now again, this is separated not just by thousands of miles, but by thousands of years. And you can see again, he's got 3 animals facing in and 1 animal facing out. Exact same posture. Name means the exact same thing. Pashupati and Cernunnos both mean more to the animals. When you put these two together, the only explanation is that anyone has ever come up for this is just crazy explanations. A guy that first discovered this thought this was proof that Buddha was real and in the subconscious minds of all humans. That was one of the explanations. But this, not just these two. This image has been now found all over the world. And this really brings us to the most extraordinary symbol pattern on planet Earth. Does anybody know what that would be? In fact, this is one of the greatest anthropological mysteries of all time. It's a symbol, one we've all heard of. Okay, I'll just give it to you. Okay? Every single culture on planet Earth, they have found, has stories about this image. And the stories are all the same. In fact, when you start looking at these symbol configurations, you start to find some extraordinary patterns. This is the official flag of Moscow. Found it just behind Putin, in fact, recently as he's giving the State of the Union address. This is the image on his podium. Official flag of Moscow. Armed warrior thrusting a spear into the mouth of an attacking dragon. Here's the official flag of Spain. Armed warrior, spear, mouth of an attacking dragon. Here is Ethiopia. Here is Poland. And it's not just the symbol configurations. When I started studying this was where I first began I wasn't trying to crack the Da Vinci Code. I was doing literary patterns. I was traveling all over the world and finding these patterns in the symbology and literary record. And I started studying this, and I found out that there was a mythologist in the 1960s who noticed this decades ago. His name was Joseph Fontenrose, and he put together a book about the dragon pattern. He compiled hundreds and hundreds of dragon stories from all over the world and found there was a very specific 60-point pattern involved. It was 2 pages long. These are just the outlines. We know the story. The dragon lives in the wilderness. It attacks at night. It takes the money and back into its cave that it guards. You guys know this? Until a hero rises who can defend the city against the dragon. How many people haven't heard that story? No one. No one hasn't heard that story, because the same story has been found in cultures all over the world. And this has been a growing anthropological mystery, to the point that about a year ago, a couple years ago now, mythologists from around the world compiled every single legend and myth, every folk tale, every single story that involves mythical creatures, from ogres and fairies and unicorns and dragons from all over the world. And they put them into a database. And they found an extraordinary picture emerge. The dragon pattern is only one of the patterns among what they found 695 point myth pattern. This is a map of the entire planet. Okay? This is where they found that myth pattern. Everywhere. And the dragon was one part of it. And it involves a series of stories and myths and legends that all take on the exact same story arc. Very specific story arc. In fact, this has now become the single greatest mystery probably in the historical world. How is it, this is the conclusion of the mystery, how is it that every single culture in the world, I mean, we're talking from Polynesians to Easter Island, to Sub-Saharan Africans, to the Native Americans, to the Aztecs and Mayans, to the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and the Japanese, every single culture in the world thousands of years ago was telling the exact same story. Mythical story. Involving gods and goddesses coming around and manipulating humans. Okay? The only way that this story was told everywhere is that the story was being told by the Central Council of Hunters and Gatherers. Okay? And it meant something to them. It's an historical story. It's an historical story, actually, about the history of humans. We're going to get into just a little bit of it. Are you ready for this? Okay. The Central Council told the story, and all the regional councils carried it to all the various parts of the planet. Now, I took this understanding that there was a central council governing the affairs of all hunters and gatherers, that they had regional councils and national councils, and this was the government structure of the nomadic world, into my research into the history of civilization, okay? And I found this really extraordinary picture emerge. This is the first city we ever found, Jericho. You guys familiar with Jericho? Okay. Did you know they used to think that it was just a myth until like 10 years ago? They thought it was just a myth because it was like Atlantis or many other mythical cities. Or like Sodom and Gomorrah, they used to think was just a myth until, guess what? They found it. They found Sodom and Gomorrah not that long ago. But they found Jericho. And guess what else they found? Jericho had, what's Jericho's most significant feature?
Walls.
Walls. And they found the walls. And it dates to 9400 BC, and it is our oldest city that we found. Now, when studying the archaeological record of Jericho, what they found is that Jericho developed for a period of time and then would suddenly collapse. Little time would go by and it would start to develop again. And then it would suddenly collapse. This happened 5 times in its history. Over and over and over again. And there's no explanation for it. And I picked up the historical record and found the exact same pattern continued. Civilizations would develop. This is a population curve from the oldest known piece of writing till today. And then they would suddenly collapse, fall the Akkadian Empire. You see this massive drop-off. Then they would develop again, And we see this sudden collapse at the late Bronze Age collapse. Historians believe that the entire population of Mesopotamia fell by over 80% during that period. In fact, it's such a period of destruction, it's detectable in the geological layer. You can see it as a layer of ash. Every single city in Egypt was burnt to the ground. Same thing develops, then suddenly collapses at the collapse of the Roman Empire. And we're familiar with this one more because this is the Dark Ages. You guys familiar with the Dark Ages? These are all called periods of Dark Ages. This is the late Bronze Age Dark Ages, this is the Ancient Dark Ages. But this same pattern emerges. And what I began to notice was that at each one of these collapse points, hunters and gatherers, massive groupings of hunters and gatherers, were attacking the regions at the time. Okay? And I began to read the stories. And we're not going to be able to go through all of them. We're just going to go through just the beginning. This is the oldest piece of literature ever discovered on planet Earth. I've been mentioning it. This is the Instructions of Sherpa. And it was found about 12 miles northwest of the ancient city of Nippur. And it contains a whole bunch of instructions. Now, this is the oldest window that we have into our history as a civilization. It's the oldest piece of writing we can translate into English. And it's a bunch of just rules for living. Just really pragmatic rules. Some of them are really my favorites. Like one of them says, don't pass judgment after you drink beer. Very practical stuff. I use them in my own life now. One of them says, don't build a well in the middle of your road. I don't know why they had to write that one, but my favorite says, don't choose your wife at a festival. Because, and it gives a reason for this one. It says because all of her jewelry is probably fake. And she's putting on her best behavior. That's what it says. It's like, don't choose your wife at a club. I don't know. Maybe that's why I'm still single. Anyway, I digress, okay? Among all these lines of practical observations, though, is this one that really does stand out. It's the only one of its kind. It's the only one that there's a mythical nature to it. It says, to get lost is bad for a dog, but terrible for a man. For on the unfamiliar way to the edge of the mountains, the gods of the mountains are man-killers. They don't build houses there as men do. They don't build cities there as men do. So it's telling people, don't travel too far from the city. Okay? All these rules, it's dozens and dozens and dozens of rules about how to rotate your crops and where to live and how to build your houses and how to build your farms. And then this one that says, and also, don't go too far from the city. Because if you get close to the mountains, you're going to encounter an enemy living there. Now, this enemy doesn't build permanent structures like you do. They're not building houses or buildings, but they're still there. And they hate you. Who do you think that they were talking about? Knowing now that there was a very sophisticated network of hunters and gatherers living in the wilderness. Who do you think they were talking? Who are the gods of the mountains? Yeah, yes. It was the councils of the nomadic tribal leaders that were much more sophisticated than we had anticipated, capable of organizing hundreds of thousands of people over very, very long periods of time. Okay? I took that knowledge through the entire literary record. Okay? You can Google the ancient literature, by the way, yourself. And you can get a list of every single document that we've ever excavated from 2600 BC till the year 0. And that's what I did. And then I just began reading them all. I obviously have no life. And what I began to notice is that all of the stories show, every single period, that the gods of the mountains were coordinating these attacks. Historians have no explanation for this. They call it systems collapse, in fact. They just think that every 1,500 years on the dime, that human beings just start killing themselves for no reason. But when I looked into the stories are very clear. The gods of the mountains were coordinating these attacks. And when you look into the historical records, you find massive populations of hunters and gatherers were attacking these regions every time. Okay? This was all speculative until I began to build this picture. And you can see what the picture is. We used to think that the civilizations and the agricultural systems were the most sophisticated of their time, but this flips the picture on its head. It says that no, prior to the very first city, hunters and gatherers had a global government. and they were capable of very extraordinary things, organizing very large numbers over long periods of time, and that they were coordinating these collapse points. Does that make sense? This was speculative until I encountered the Gnostic Gospels. Okay? The Gnostic Gospels were first discovered in 1945 by a guy named Muhammad Ali. I'm serious. That was actually, I'm not obviously not that guy, but a guy named Muhammad Ali in Egypt, just outside of a town called Nag Hammadi. He was digging for fertilizer, and he uncovered this gigantic red jar, huge red jar, and he takes it home to his mom's house. I can't believe this is a true story. And they thought that there might be gold in it, and they cracked it open, and to their dismay, they just found dozens and dozens of old books. And they didn't know that the books were worth way more than their weight in gold. And the mom began systematically burning them for kindling. And of course, they didn't know that they were sitting on the literary treasure of the 20th century by far. The Gnostic Gospels were all talked about for centuries and centuries and centuries, but no one had ever found one, not even one. They knew that they existed because the popes of the millennium always said, if you ever find one of these, and they would name some of them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, if you ever find one of these, burn it immediately. And so throughout the entire world, no Gnostic Gospel had ever been found. And here they had the entire library. She gets through over half of them until one of the pages makes its way into the antiquities market and begins to get translated. And it's an ancient Coptic. And the initial scholar begins translating the opening line of the Gospel of Thomas. That's the page he happened to find. And it reads, "These are the secret words that Jesus spoke only to his twin brother." I mean, not only did this guy know that he was in possession of a genuine Gnostic document that dated almost 1,500 years previous to that, but that the explosive nature of that opening line, can you even imagine? I mean, they frantically trace this back to this lady's hut as she's probably putting another one into the thing. They're like, no. And they salvage 52 of the documents. And this makes up the entire bulk of what we know worldwide of the Gnostic Gospels. They have great names like the Gospel of Truth and the Thunder Perfect Mind. I love that one. And the Trimorphic Protonoia on the origin of the world. And they contain, since they've been found, they have been translated into English. Okay? And I have met with most of the scholars who've done the translations at this point. Most of the original scholars. They're still alive. They're getting older now, but they're still alive. And I've asked them, what do these documents mean? Okay? And they've told me, they don't mean anything. They are gibberish. They have statements, but the statements don't mean anything. Like, this is the opening paragraph, the real true translation of the opening paragraph of On the Origin of the World. And it reads, "Seeing as though everybody, gods of the world and mankind, says that nothing existed prior to chaos, I, in distinction to them, shall demonstrate that they're all mistaken, because they're not familiar with the origin of chaos nor with its root. Here's the demonstration." Does that make sense to anybody? When you read that, do you go, "Oh, I know what that means." Neither did anyone else. Now, the reason why no one has been able to figure out what these documents mean is because they're written in code. Okay? Now, if you remember the Instructions of Sherpa, if it is true that the gods of the mountains were the nomadic tribal nations and man were the agriculturalists, okay? All I did was I started to take that dichotomy through the historical record. And the reason why these documents can't be translated is because what I found was a cipher began to emerge. A cipher for translating ancient mythology into a literal historical record. And while it was speculative at first, the Gnostic Gospels have proven that the cipher is real. So, are you ready for the Da Vinci Code? Okay, without further ado, here is the cipher. It's very simple. The cipher is so simple I could actually explain it to any of you in the course of a single cup of coffee. Okay? It contains 2 separate columns of words. And this isn't all the words that they use, but this is most of them. Now, if you were to cover any one of the columns, you'll notice that they contain binary pairs. So if I were to tell you any one of the pairs, you'd automatically know the other pair. What's the opposite of above? What's the opposite of immortal? What's the opposite of summer? Or perfect? Imperfect. Okay, you see that? Light, dark. Now, all you have to do is if you encounter any of the terms on the left column, instead of thinking whatever that term means, you simply substitute hunters and gatherers. If you see any of the terms on the right column, you simply substitute agriculturalists. It's that simple. So if you see the term above, instead of thinking above, what do you put into the text? What was that? What was that? Hunters and gatherers. You got to go over it because it's confusing to some people, isn't it? Okay. And if you see the term man, instead of thinking man, what do you substitute? Agriculturalists. It's that simple. Any of the terms on the left, you substitute hunters and gatherers. Any of the terms on the right, you substitute agriculturalists. Okay? Now, I want you guys to really quite understand how significant this cipher is. For one thing, I took this cipher around to the math communities of the country. I even took it to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Are you guys familiar with the Naval Academy? Okay, this is where the best cryptographers in the world are trained. And I actually just walked right onto the campus and I said, I think I found a cipher that is got national security implications and also that you've never seen before. And of course, that lit their eyes up a little. And they called in the captain of cryptography, the guy who teaches cryptography to our entire military. And he came out and met with me. It was actually just a bit of luck because he didn't have to happen to be there. And we had a 2-hour conversation and I showed him this cipher. I asked him, have you ever seen this cipher before? And he said, no. You teach the history of cryptography to our entire military and you've never seen this cipher before. And he goes, no, definitely not. No one has. Is it a cipher? It's definitely a cipher. It's definitely a cipher. A cipher is a way to input information into a text or a statement without anyone knowing what it means except the people who know the cipher. It's definitely a cipher. He said it's a type of stenographic code. Okay? So that's the first thing to know. You're definitely looking at a code. The second thing, it has some real internal coherence to it. It's got these binary pairs. In fact, if you look at the binary pairs, you'll notice that many of them have a better and worse side to them, right? Do you see that? Like perfect and imperfect. Okay? Or like heaven and earth. God and man. Most of them do, in fact. What side is all the better ones on? What side? Hunters and gatherers. Okay. Why do you think that is? Uncle Jim just said it. They're the ones that were running it. They're the ones who made the cipher. Hunters and gatherers created this cipher so that they could coordinate attacks on agricultural systems without them knowing. Okay? So that they could talk about their history without people knowing what it meant. Very simple cipher. Now, watch what happens when you apply this cipher back to the opening statement On the Origin of the World. And this made Captain Tortora's hair stand up. Okay? I color-coded it just to make it easier for you. Blue is hunters and gatherers, red is agriculturalists. We can read this together. Seeing that everybody. What do the gods stand for? Seeing that everybody. Hunters and gatherers of the world and agriculturalists. Says that nothing existed prior to agriculturalists. I, in distinction of them, shall demonstrate that they're all mistaken because they're not acquainted with the origin of agriculturalists, nor with its roots. It takes pure gibberish. A code no one has found in decades and decades studying these documents. It's so simple. In fact, Isaac Newton spent the majority of his career looking for this cipher. He knew it existed. Most of his journals are just filled with it. He called it the Bible code. He's just filled with it. He did physics on the side, historians think. In fact, most historians think that he was part crazy because of the fact that he was looking for this cipher most of the time. But he knew it existed. He overthought it. He did character substitution, not concept substitution. It's simple and elegant and powerful. It translates all 52 documents. This is the opening paragraph. This is one paragraph among 52 documents. And do you get the message? Isn't it clear? The author's saying, look, I know that both hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists don't think that there was a time before agriculture, but I know there was a time before agriculture, and I can prove it. Do you want to see the proof? The proof is extraordinary. Remember the time, just like an hour ago, when I told you about this? Hunters and gatherers, tens of thousands of years ago, we now know, were tracking animal patterns against the sun and the moon and the constellations. So they looked up at the night sky, we now know 42,000 years ago, because that's when the first paintings emerged that showed the calculations. 42,000 years ago, they looked up in the night sky and they noticed there was a relationship between these constellations and biological patterns on Earth. So they began to glean real data, real information about how the world works from the constellations, okay? And this event predates agriculture by 30,000 years. This is the second paragraph of On the Origin of the World. This is the proof. He says, after the natural structures of the, who are the immortal beings? Hunters and gatherers, had fully, completely developed, knowledge began to emanate from the constellations. It is called the Sophia. This is where we get philosophy, wisdom. The Sophia proved its usefulness, the knowledge, and showed itself to have an unimaginable magnitude. He's talking about this relationship. The Sophia was between the and those that came into being after them. The Sophia functioned as a veil, dividing from those hunters and gatherers. It's really remarkable. It takes two paragraphs that mean absolutely nothing and makes one statement of fact and one proof of that statement of fact. And this goes on and on and on. And all 52 of those documents, what they show, when you put the history together, they go through the historical record using these code words so that when you read it, they just don't seem like they're talking about anything. But what they're talking about is the history of our ancestors, Homo sapiens, dating from the cognitive revolution all the way through to the discovery of animal husbandry and agriculture, all the way through to the development of civilization and these collapse points that it begins talking about, how it coordinated them, all the way through to the Roman Empire and the establishment of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, it's now showing, is the biggest threat to their central council. Okay? And here's this is the Da Vinci Code part, okay? So in order to understand the Da Vinci Code, you need to understand these binaries. Now there's the perfect, imperfect, but there's also, remember, the mountain valley. Which one is the mountain referred to, do you think? Which half? Okay, you guys are getting it. And the valley, agriculturalists, okay? Now, there's one extra element, though, isn't there, in the Da Vinci Code, in the Mona Lisa. There's the mountains and valleys, but then there's also the lakes, the water. In order to know what the water means, you just have to keep reading more of these documents. And this is one of the paragraphs that pinpoints what the water means. And it's the same question as On the Origin of the World. Okay, it's the origin story. Jesus would ask, how did everything come to be? And this is his answer. He said, when the hunters and gatherers established their relationship with the cosmos, we now know what that's referring to. Okay? The hunters and gatherers, collected water from it, and it inhabited many. The water was higher than the path that surrounds the entire agricultural system. The collected water existed outside of the agriculturalists and acted as a great fire encircling the agriculturalists like a wall. After a time, many things, hunting and gathering, became separated from what was agricultural. Okay? This is the same story as the On the Origin of the World. This is a little bit higher level, so I want to see if anybody can determine what does the water mean. The water in this one is equivalent to what in the other one? Does anybody know? What was that? The what? The world? The wall. Okay, the water in this one is equivalent to the Sophia in this one. it says that the water was higher than the path that surrounds the earth, and the water was like this knowledge that separating these two systems. Okay, the water and the Sophia are the same. So it allowed me to put this extra piece into the Da Vinci Code, this piece down here. Okay, the knowledge equals water. And throughout the entire Nag Hammadi library, when they say water, they're meaning this information that they were gathering. And there's a reason why they use water as a metaphor for that, because it was water when you look like worldwide, the river systems and the creeks, you know, it all collects into like a river, and then it collects into a bigger body, and then it collects into... This was a perfect metaphor for how the information is collecting into these central councils, into the national and regional, and eventually the central council. Does that make sense? Okay. So, just to see a couple more of these working, this is a Gospel of Philip. We don't have a lot of time. Oh, it's been an hour. And you're still here. Is this interesting? Okay. Okay, we'll get to the Vinci part, and then I'll see if you guys have any questions. But this is one I do want to go over, because, I mean, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, this is a really stunning one, because it hits the nail directly on the head. I couldn't even believe it when I found this. You can see that these are used as a teaching tool, both to teach the history, to teach the concepts, and to show the code functioning. So, this one says, there are domestic animals, like the bull and the donkey, and others of this kind. Okay? Others are wild and live apart in the wilderness. You can see that he almost teaches the children. There's agricultural systems, and then there are wild systems. Then it says, man, and what is man? Agriculturalists, you guys plow the fields by means of the domestic animals. And from this, both you and he is nourished. Okay? He and the animals. And then it says, compare the perfect man. Yeah. It is through a different means that he is nourished. You can see why the scholars around the world, to this day even, to this day, have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. It's paragraph after paragraph like this. But once you know that simple binary code, how obvious is this? How obvious is this to you guys? It's remarkable. So here's the Da Vinci Code aspect, okay? When we come back to the Mona Lisa, this actually begins to read down like a book, doesn't it? It's very simple. She's got a look on her face. I know something you don't know. And believe me, it's a doozy. I didn't spend 15 years of my life carrying this dang picture all over the place to tell future generations that I know some stupid historical mundane fact, okay? I'm going to tell you something world-changing. He's got this clear dichotomy, half and half of the painting. Half mountains, half valley. What are the mountains? Hunters and gatherers. Valley, agriculturalists. What does the water mean? The knowledge that the hunters and gatherers were keeping. When that knowledge that they've been keeping for all these years makes its way from where it is currently in a handful of just a very small number of people worldwide into the rest of you. Basically, when what happens, just like what I just did today, that was the water transferring from here to here. It's going to drown, saturate the central figure, retroactively proving that who knew the code? Leonardo da Vinci. All right. Are there any questions?
Do you have a CD of all of this?
Do I have a CD? I'm making one right now. Yes, I'm making one right now. If you guys do have any questions, he painted this into all of his masterworks, by the way. You can see this is Madonna on the Rocks. Look at what he did in the back here. Okay? Here's the Lord's Supper. It's unbelievable. Right in the background. You can see it through the window. I want you guys to follow me, because this is actually information we really do have to make it to the public, okay? Before someone shoots me. No. But legitimately. And this is my Instagram. That's my email. Feel free to take a picture of that, okay? If any of you have any questions, you can come up to me afterwards. But thank you so much for coming out to the Vinci Code Part 1. And I'll see you at the show tonight.
That was super cool. Really cool. HODGK's David tonight. He's going to be right in here at 8:15. And 10 o'clock, we are doing a little bit of cruise long trivia right after this. Don't go anywhere. If you are cruise long trivia people, if you're not, then you can go wherever you like. But we're going to get started.